Picture this, a Saturday in Bellingham, Washington. The parking lots that used to fill with BC plates by noon are half empty. Over in Buffalo and Niagara Falls, the bridges that once pulsed with cross-border day trippers feel slow. Fewer carts, fewer bags, fewer swipes. And for American retailers on the northern border, the cash registers are telling the same story. Canadians are quietly pulling their wallets back home, and the missing money adds up to billions. Here's the twist. This is not a one-week blip. It's a months-long slide. Canada is the United States' number one international visitor market, 20.4 million visits in 2024. Generating $20.5 billion in spending and supporting roughly 140,000 American jobs. When your largest customer starts staying away, even a 10% drop implies more than $2 billion gone from U.S. tills. That's not softness. That's a shockwave that moves from outlet malls and gas stations to hotels, restaurants, and local payrolls. And the latest signals are blunt. In July 2025, Canadians' travel to the U.S. was down for the 7th straight month. Compared with July 2024, car trips fell by about 37% and air trips by about 26%, according to Statistics Canada tallies reported this week. Cross-border businesses from Washington State to upstate New York are reporting thinner foot traffic and trimmed hours. When the loonie buys less, border hassles rise and politics turn toxic. A family that once crossed for deals and a Cheesecake Factory lunch now books a weekend in Whistler or Montreal instead, or just stays home. So tonight we're following the money. How big is the withdrawal? Why is it happening now? Who's getting hit and who's cashing in? And if nothing changes, what does a multi-billion-dollar Canadian retreat mean for American main streets on the 49th parallel? To understand just how big this shift is, you first need to know the baseline, because this isn't about a few fewer souvenir t-shirts or a couple of empty tables at Denny's. Canada isn't just a foreign market for U.S. tourism and retail, it's the foreign market. In 2024, 20.4 million Canadian visits to the United States generated $20.5 billion in spending. That's everything from weekend shopping trips and NHL away games to gas fill-ups, casino stays, and Target runs. According to the U.S. Travel Association, those dollars supported around 140,000 American jobs in retail, hospitality, and transport. Border towns and regional hubs from Vermont to Washington state built entire micro-economies on that steady stream of Canadian customers. But 2025 is telling a different story. In the latest Statistics Canada data, July marked the 7th consecutive month of decline in Canadian travel to the U.S. Compared with July 2024, car trips dropped by about 37%, and air trips fell by roughly 26%. And that's not an outlier. June saw similar weakness, with car crossings down 33% and air arrivals down more than 22%. The reasons are a mix of cold economics and warmer-blooded politics. The Canadian dollar, the loonie, has been stuck near 1.37 Canadian dollars to $1 US, a level that makes cross-border shopping painfully expensive. Every US price tag is effectively marked up by an extra third before you even add sales tax. That's fine when gas is dirt cheap or the exchange rate swings in Canada's favor. It's brutal when both work against you. Layer on trade tensions and the mood sours further. In early 2025, Washington floated and then implemented targeted tariffs on certain Canadian exports. Ottawa pushed back rhetorically, but the broader public read the headlines as US versus Canada, and a slice of consumers decided to vote with their feet, or rather, keep their feet at home. This wasn't an organized boycott so much as a quiet mental calculation. Why drive 3 hours, pay 35% more, and spend money in a country whose politics feel hostile right now? The impact is playing out in real-world snapshots. Bellingham, Washington, long a magnet for Vancouver area shoppers, especially for cheaper gas and bulk buys. Local business groups report double-digit drops in Canadian customers. Some stores have cut opening hours, a few have closed entirely. Buffalo and Niagara Falls, New York, CBP data shows Peace Bridge traffic from Canada down 22% year-over-year in May, Rainbow Bridge down 29%. Hotel occupancy in parts of Niagara County is off by similar margins. It's not just brick and mortar that's hurting. A Vancity/Global News review found British Columbia residents are also spending markedly less on US-based online retailers. That's money that used to flow south even without crossing the border. Now it's being captured domestically or diverted to non-US sellers. Meanwhile, Canadian tourism bodies and economists are smiling. The Conference Board of Canada estimates that if this stay-home trend holds through the year, domestic tourism could gain up to 10.3 billion Canadian dollars in extra spending. Even factoring in fewer U.S. tourists coming north, the net gain could be 8.8 billion Canadian dollars for Canada's own hotels, attractions, and shops. This redirection of spending is a classic case of substitution. Canadian households still budget for vacations and shopping splurges. They're just doing it in Banff instead of Boston, in Montreal instead of Miami. For the U.S., that means less foreign currency inflow, less support for retail payrolls, and less tax revenue in border states. For Canada, it means more domestic economic activity and potentially a virtuous cycle of reinvestment in local tourism infrastructure. Politically, the optics cut both ways. In Washington, the numbers risk becoming another data point in debates about whether protectionist trade measures actually help American workers. In Ottawa, they can be spun as proof that Canadians are resilient and willing to support their own economy when foreign conditions turn unfavorable. So the stage is set. A once steady $20 billion cross-border pipeline is sputtering. The reasons are measurable, and the beneficiaries aren't in the U.S. The question now is just how deep this will cut and how long it will last. From an economist's standpoint, this Canadian retreat is less about a sudden collapse in consumer demand and more about the accumulation of several overlapping stressors that finally tipped the balance. Let's break those stressors down because together they explain why billions in spending are no longer crossing the 49th parallel. 1. The currency penalty. The Canadian dollar's persistent weakness is the single most visible factor. At roughly 1.37 Canadian dollars to $1 US, every American price tag has a built-in 37% premium for Canadians. A $100 pair of sneakers in Buffalo effectively costs $137 before tax for someone from Ontario. And that's not counting the gas or airfare to get there. This exchange rate math has a way of creeping into every purchase decision. When the loonie was closer to parity a decade ago, cross-border malls could bank on a steady stream of Canadians filling SUVs with consumer goods. Now, the price advantage often swings in the opposite direction, especially for goods that have competitive Canadian retail channels. The weaker CAD is not a temporary blip. It's been under pressure from interest rate differentials, weaker GDP growth, and commodity price swings. Even if the Bank of Canada tightens policy modestly, the Federal Reserve's relative stance is likely to keep the greenback stronger in the near term. That means this currency penalty will continue to discourage discretionary U.S. trips unless something else offsets it. 2. Trade policy and sentiment effects economics textbooks talk about price effects from tariffs, but they rarely dwell on the pride effects. In early 2025, new U.S. tariffs on selected Canadian exports made national news in Canada. For many households, this wasn't just about whether tariffs would change the price of lumber or dairy. It was a signal of political tension. That tension has a way of influencing consumer sentiment. People don't like feeling unwelcome, and they can express that by redirecting their spending. Unlike formal boycotts, which are often organized and publicized, this is more of a diffuse, organic phenomenon. A family that might have planned a weekend in Boston starts browsing for Banff hotel deals. A retired couple who drive south to Florida each winter for shopping and sun instead check out package tours to Mexico or Portugal. These micro-choices, repeated thousands of times, aggregate into billions in foregone U.S. revenue. 3. The domestic substitution boom Canada's tourism industry has been quick to seize the opportunity, with the Conference Board projecting up to 10.3 billion Canadian dollars in extra domestic spending this year if trends hold. Provincial tourism boards have doubled down on marketing, staycations, and local attractions. British Columbia has leaned on its ski resorts, Ontario on its wine country and lakefronts, Quebec on its festivals and culinary scene. The shift isn't just about geography, it's about experience. Canadians are asking, if I'm going to spend $2,000, why not make it a trip where my money supports local jobs and the exchange rate isn't working against me? That framing resonates, especially in a period of elevated inflation where people are more conscious of keeping money in the community. 4. The erosion of the cross-border habits are powerful in economics. Once a consumer develops a pattern, say quarterly outlet runs to Seattle or bi-monthly grocery trips to Vermont, the inertia keeps it going. But if something disrupts the habit long enough, a new routine forms. The pandemic was the first big disruptor, and many of those cross-border habits never fully recovered. Now, with currency headwinds and political frictions layered on top, those dormant habits risk being replaced permanently. That's what makes the current downturn potentially more lasting than a typical cyclical dip. If Canadian households learn to source goods domestically or from online alternatives, U.S. border towns can't just flip a switch to bring them back. 5. Regional asymmetries in impact. Not all of the U.S. is feeling this equally. The pain is most acute in border economies. Northern Washington, upstate New York, Vermont, Michigan, where Canadian spending can account for a double-digit share of retail turnover. In Bellingham, surveys show more than half of local businesses have seen revenue declines tied to reduced Canadian traffic, with some reporting drops of 20 to 30%. In Buffalo and Niagara Falls, bridge traffic counts line up eerily well with hotel occupancy declines and restaurant sales. By contrast, major U.S. cities further from the border, New York, Las Vegas, Miami, are less dependent on Canadian inflows. They will feel the pinch in the aggregate tourism numbers, but not as sharply in any given neighborhood. 6. The online dimension. Even when Canadians weren't physically crossing the border, their wallets often were, thanks to e-commerce. U.S.-based online retailers had been major beneficiaries of Canadian demand, especially in categories like apparel, electronics, and specialty goods. But here too, the currency penalty bites, and Canadian consumers are increasingly finding local or international alternatives that price in CAD. That's a revenue stream U.S. merchants may not easily win back, because digital shopping habits shift faster than physical travel habits. 7. Long-term risks for U.S. retail and hospitality. If this trend holds for another 12 to 18 months, some structural damage is likely. Border-dependent businesses may close, reducing variety and competition for those who remain. Hotels and restaurants that catered to Canadian guests may shift their marketing to domestic travelers, but that can be a slow and costly pivot. Once that capacity is gone, even a rebound in Canadian travel won't restore the old ecosystem overnight. There's also a fiscal angle. Local and state governments that rely on sales tax from tourist spending may face budget shortfalls, especially if they had been using robust 2024 numbers as a baseline for planning. That can mean deferred infrastructure projects or cuts to local services, further eroding the visitor experience and making recovery harder. 8. Scenarios for the next 12 months. In a moderate recovery scenario, the CAD strengthens to around 1.30, U.S.-Canada political tensions cool, and Canadian travel spending recovers to within 10% of 2024 levels by mid-2026. That would still imply a $2 billion annual gap versus pre-decline norms, but it would be manageable. In a persistence scenario, the CAD stays weak Domestic tourism in Canada remains aggressively marketed, and cross-border travel remains down 20 to 30%. That would lock in a $4 to $6 billion annual revenue hole for U.S. retail and hospitality, with Canada capturing the lion's share of the redirected spending. In the shock scenario, additional trade disputes or a further CAD slide deepen the decline to 35% or more. At that point, we're talking about losses exceeding $7 billion annually from Canadian visitors alone, enough to force a visible retrenchment in some border state economies. 9. Why this matters beyond the border. It's tempting to treat this as a niche story. Border malls and gas stations feeling the squeeze. But the U.S.-Canada retail tourism relationship is one of the largest bilateral consumer flows in the world. A prolonged disruption sends ripples into wholesale supply chains, trucking, marketing, and even real estate in border regions. For a White House that wants to project economic strength, headlines about billions quietly evaporating from a reliable source of foreign spending are not helpful optics. In short, the Canadian pullback is a case study in how currency movements, trade policy, and consumer psychology interact. Each element on its own might not derail a $20 billion flow of commerce. Together, they've done exactly that. And unless one of those factors changes materially, the money and the shoppers aren't coming back anytime soon. Let's play devil's advocate for a moment, because somewhere in Washington, a few officials are probably telling themselves, relax, Canadians will be back. They always come back. Sure, that's one way to think about it. If you ignore the fact that habits can be broken and wallets have long memories, pretending this is a temporary blip is like telling yourself your ex will call once they realize you were actually the best thing that ever happened to them. Newsflash: they're already dating someone else. In this case, Whistler, Banff, and Mexico. The "they need us more" fallacy. Some in the U.S. might argue that Canadians need to shop in America for better prices, wider selection, or certain brands. That was true when the loonie was strong, when border waits were short, and when political relations were warmer. But today, Canada's retail landscape has matured. The same outlet brands that used to lure cross-border shoppers now have Canadian locations or ship domestically, often with pricing that undercuts the currency penalty. The "we have what they don't" card is looking pretty frayed, and for anything still cheaper in the U.S., Canadians have a new trick: wait for sales, buy online from a third country seller, and bypass both the drive and the political headache. It's like telling someone they have to fly to New York to get bagels when Costco now sells a dozen for $6. They'll come back for the experience defense. Yes, some border towns offer a fun novelty. Gas is sometimes cheaper, restaurants have different menus, and you can stock up on quirky American cereals. But that's not enough to overcome a 37% currency markup, long waits at customs, and the quiet feeling you might be funding a political climate you disagree with. It's a bit like saying, people will still go to the movies even if tickets cost $25 and the popcorn's $15, because they love the smell of the lobby. Maybe, but not in the same numbers, and not as often. The "it's just politics, it'll blow over" argument. Another favorite in DC is the assumption that political dust-ups fade and consumers forget. Here's the satire-worthy part. This isn't the first time political rhetoric has bled into consumer behavior, and it won't be the last. You can't slap tariffs on your closest neighbor, posture about protecting American interests in a way that implies your trading partner is the problem, and then act surprised when their citizens decide to keep their dollars at home. It's like loudly insulting your neighbor's lawn every weekend and then wondering why they stopped coming to your BBQ. Meanwhile, in Canada, the Canadian government and local tourism boards are quietly thrilled. They don't need to mount some big Shop Canadian campaign. The U.S. is doing the marketing for them. Every headline about tariffs, every news segment about a sliding loonie, every report of declining border traffic reinforces the narrative. Stay home, save money, support local. If anything, Ottawa gets to look responsible and patriotic without lifting a finger. And the best part, they get the economic multiplier effect of those redirected dollars. Money that might otherwise have been spent in Seattle or Buffalo is now keeping restaurants open in Kelowna or hotels full in Prince Edward County. The satirical twist: America as the best PR agent for Canadian tourism. If we were writing the ad copy for Destination Canada, we'd thank the US government for its unpaid internship in Canadian tourism marketing. Why spend $137 for $100 worth of goods? Shop Canadian. Tired of long waits at the Peace Bridge? We have bridges too, and none of them require a passport. Avoid the politics. Keep the poutine. It's absurd, but it's working. And if US officials think this will flip back automatically, they're ignoring the structural shifts already in motion. The counter-argument's blind spot. The biggest flaw in the Canadians will be back narrative is that it assumes the US still has a competitive edge that can't be replicated. But pricing advantages are shrinking. Online retail is borderless, and the political goodwill that once lubricated cross-border commerce is wearing thin. Without one of those three levers working in America's favor, there's no automatic rebound mechanism. And while it's easy to downplay the Canadian market because it's only $20 billion compared to total US retail sales, that's still $20 billion in foreign money, the kind of inflow that supports jobs without increasing domestic debt. Lose it, and you either make it up with other foreign visitors, good luck, Europe and Asia have their own headwinds, or with domestic spending, which just recirculates dollars, not adds new ones. In short, the satire here writes itself. U.S. policy is simultaneously discouraging a loyal customer base and encouraging that same customer base to find alternatives. It's the equivalent of your favorite diner raising prices by 35%, giving you side-eye when you walk in, and then wondering why you now have a punch card at the cafe across the street. So, here's where we land. A year ago, Canada was the United States' most reliable tourism and retail partner. 20.4 million visits, $20.5 billion in spending, 140,000 U.S. jobs supported. Fast forward to 2025, and those numbers are sliding hard. 7 straight months of decline, car crossings down over a third, air arrivals down by a quarter, and billions quietly evaporating from the cash registers of border towns and big city retailers alike. The triggers are clear: a weak loonie that turns every U.S. price into sticker shock, political tensions amplified by tariffs, and a domestic Canadian tourism sector that's seizing the moment to keep spending at home. Together, they've created a feedback loop. Fewer Canadians crossing means less reason for U.S. businesses to cater to them, which means even fewer will bother making the trip. For Americans, this is more than a border town story. It's a case study in how quickly a dependable market can cool, and how the combination of currency, policy, and sentiment can reshape spending flows on a continental scale. For Canadians, it's proof that redirecting spending inward can deliver a tangible economic boost, an estimated 8.8 billion Canadian dollars net gain this year alone. The choice for policymakers is whether to treat this as a short-term irritation or a wake-up call. Do nothing, and the habit of cross-border shopping could fade for good. Address the underlying frictions, from currency competitiveness to political tone, and maybe the flow can be revived. For now, one fact is unavoidable. Canadians are voting with their wallets, and the ballot box is labeled anywhere but the U.S. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit like, share it with someone who thinks they'll always come back, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the economics of everyday life. Because these numbers, they're not just statistics, they're the receipts.